The humid Atlanta air clung to Caleb Thornton's skin like a second layer as he trudged along the cracked sidewalk, his tattered coat dragging lightly across the ground. The city's pulse thrummed around him, car horns blaring in the distance, the steady hum of traffic on Peachtree Road, and the faint chatter of well-dressed pedestrians weaving through Buckhead's upscale district. Caleb, a millionaire who'd built his fortune through savvy tech startups, was far removed from the polished boardrooms and penthouse suites that defined his usual existence. Tonight, he was someone else entirely, a disheveled, unshaven man with dirt-streaked hands, his face half hidden beneath a worn baseball cap. His tailored suits, gleaming Rolex, and custom cufflinks were locked away in his sprawling mansion, replaced by thrift store rags that carried the faint, musty scent of mothballs. He'd left behind his Bentley, his wealth, and every trace of his identity, driven by a single burning purpose to test the character of Amara Jackson, the new housekeeper he'd hired for his estate. Caleb had grown weary of the world he inhabited, a glittering cage of superficiality and hidden agendas. The people around him, business partners, socialites, even so-called friends, wore masks of charm and loyalty, but he'd seen through their facades time and again. Flattery for favors, smiles that hid ulterior motives, promises broken as easily as they were made. He'd lost count of the betrayals, the moments when loyalty evaporated the second his wealth wasn't on the table. It had hardened him, made him skeptical of everyone. So he'd devised a plan, a test, to cut through the pretense and reveal the truth about those he allowed into his life. Amara was the latest subject. She'd been working at his mansion for just 2 weeks, her references glowing with praise for her work ethic and reliability. But Caleb trusted no one until he saw their true colors with his own eyes. Tonight, under the guise of a weary drifter, he'd find out who Amara Jackson really was. The Buckhead estate loomed ahead, its towering iron gates glinting under the amber glow of streetlights. The mansion, a sleek masterpiece of glass and steel, sprawled across manicured lawns, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the twinkling Atlanta skyline. Caleb had designed it himself, every detail a testament to his success, a monument to his rise from a scrappy entrepreneur to a titan of industry. But tonight, it wasn't his home. It was his stage, a carefully controlled environment for his experiment. He adjusted the frayed backpack slung over his shoulder, its weight a constant reminder of the role he was playing. He'd stuffed it with old clothes, a crumpled water bottle, and a few dollar bills to complete the illusion of a man down on his luck. His heart raced not from fear, but from anticipation. Would Amara turn him away, as so many others had in his previous tests? Would she see through his disguise, or would she surprise him with something unexpected? As he neared the gate, the security guard's 2 burly men in crisp black uniforms spotted him immediately. Their radios crackled with static, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, stepped forward, his hand resting casually but firmly on the holster at his hip. "Hey, you, this is private property. Move along," he barked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Caleb kept his head low, letting the brim of his cap shield his eyes, and mumbled something incoherent, playing the part of a weary, disoriented drifter. He took a hesitant step closer, testing the guard's reactions. The second guard, a younger man with a buzz cut and a stern frown, moved to block his path, his flashlight beam cutting through the dusk to illuminate Caleb's ragged figure. "Man, you deaf," I said. "Get out of here!" Marcus snapped, his tone sharper, now edged with impatience. Caleb shuffled backward, raising his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes darted toward the mansion's side entrance where he knew Amara often worked late into the evening. He needed to get closer to see how she'd respond to a stranger like him. The guards were part of the test, too, though they were unaware of his true identity. Caleb had instructed them to be vigilant, to treat any trespassers with suspicion, but he hadn't revealed his plan. Their aggression was expected, even necessary, but it still stung, a stark reminder of how the world treated those it deemed unworthy, those who didn't fit the polished mold of Buckhead's elite. Before Marcus could grab him, a soft but commanding voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "Hold on, Marcus. Let him be." Amara Jackson stood at the edge of the driveway, her silhouette framed by the warm golden light spilling from the mansion's open side door. She wore a simple navy apron tied over her jeans, her braids pulled back into a neat, practical bun. Her presence was calm, almost magnetic, like a quiet breeze that stills a brewing storm. Caleb froze his breath, catching as he studied her. She didn't look like someone who'd been scrubbing floors or polishing silver all day. There was a steadiness in her posture, a warmth in her dark eyes that made the guards pause their aggression, softening in her presence. "He's not hurting anyone," Amara said, stepping closer, her sneakers crunching softly on the gravel. Her voice was gentle but unwavering, carrying a quiet authority that demanded respect. "It's late, and he looks like he's had a rough day. Let's not make it worse." Marcus hesitated, his hand still hovering near his holster, but the younger guard lowered his flashlight, glancing at Amara with a mix of respect and uncertainty. "You sure about this? Amara boss wouldn't like strangers hanging around?" "Marcus," said, his tone softer now, almost deferential, as if Amara's word carried more weight than his own instincts. "I'll handle it," she replied, her gaze shifting to Caleb. For a moment, their eyes met, and he felt a jolt, not of recognition, but of something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Her expression wasn't pitying or suspicious. It was kind, almost searching, as if she saw more than the rags he wore, more than the dirt he'd smeared on his face to sell the disguise. "Come with me," she said to Caleb, her voice low but firm, leaving no room for argument. "You can't stay out here." Caleb nodded mutely, following her as she led him away from the guards and toward a small outbuilding nestled near the mansion's garage. The shed used for storage and staff breaks was a far cry from the opulence of the main house. Its exterior was weathered, the paint peeling in places, but inside the air smelled of pine cleaner and fresh laundry, a faint trace of lavender lingering in the corners. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, warm glow over a worn wooden table. A couple of mismatched chairs, and a small cot tucked against the wall. The space was modest but tidy, almost homey, with a few personal touches that caught Caleb's eye. A thriving potted plant on the windowsill, its green leaves vibrant against the faded wood. A faded quilt draped neatly over the cot, and a small shelf holding a stack of books, their spines worn but carefully aligned. His sharp eyes caught the titles Poetry Collections by Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes, alongside a dog-eared copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. He hadn't expected that, and it intrigued him. "Sit," Amara said, pointing to one of the chairs with a no-nonsense gesture. She didn't wait for him to respond, before turning to a tiny kitchenette in the corner, its counter barely big enough for a hot plate and a mini fridge. Caleb sat, his hands clasped tightly to maintain his act, but his mind was racing. He'd expected her to shoo him away, to offer a curt warning before calling the guards back, or at best to toss him a bottled water and send him on his way. Instead, she was rummaging through the fridge, pulling out a Tupperware container of homemade stew and a loaf of cornbread wrapped in foil. "You hungry?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Her tone wasn't patronizing or overly sympathetic. It was practical, matter-of-fact, as if feeding a stranger was just another part of her day. Caleb nodded again, his throat tight with a mix of guilt and curiosity. He wasn't used to this, being cared for without strings attached, without an agenda lurking beneath the surface. In his world, every gesture came with a price, every kindness a transaction. He watched as Amara heated the stew on the hot plate, her movements quick but deliberate, her hands steady, despite the long hours she'd likely worked. She didn't fill the silence with unnecessary chatter, but there was a quiet strength in her presence, a kind of grace, that made the small shed feel larger, warmer, more alive than it had any right to be. When she set a steaming bowl in front of him, along with a thick slice of cornbread, Caleb's stomach growled, betraying the fact that he hadn't eaten since morning. The hunger wasn't entirely fake. He'd been too consumed by his plan to bother with lunch, and the aroma of the stew, rich with beef potatoes and a hint of thyme, was almost overwhelming. "Eat slow," she said, pouring hot water from a kettle into a chipped ceramic mug and dropping in a tea bag. "It's hot." She slid the mug toward him, her fingers brushing the table lightly, and Caleb noticed the calluses on her hands, the faint lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. She couldn't have been older than 30, but there was a weight to her, a story written in the way she carried herself, in the way her shoulders sagged slightly when she thought no one was watching. He wanted to ask, to probe, to understand who she was beyond the apron and the broom, but he held back, reminding himself he was here to observe, not to engage. "Thank you," he mumbled, roughening his voice to fit his disguise. He took a cautious sip of the stew, the warmth spreading through him like a quiet embrace. It was simple, hearty, the kind of meal that spoke of care, rather than extravagance. He glanced at Amara, who was wiping down the counter with a rag, her back to him. She didn't hover or watch him eat, giving him space to breathe, to exist without judgment. It was a small gesture, but it struck him deeply. Most people would have stared, waiting for gratitude or a sob story to justify their kindness. She didn't. She just was. "You don't have to do this," he said, testing her, his words deliberate. "I'm just passing through." He wanted to see how she'd react, whether she'd push him out now, relieved to be rid of him, or if she'd keep up the act, if it was an act at all. Amara turned, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Nobody just passes through Buckhead looking like you do," she said, her voice carrying a hint of humor, but no malice. "But I'm not going to let you starve out there. Not tonight." Her eyes held his for a moment, and Caleb felt a pang of guilt sharper than before. She was being genuine, and he was deceiving her, playing a game with her kindness. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds, the clink of his spoon against the bowl, the soft hiss of the hot plate cooling down, and the distant hum of crickets outside the shed's small window. Then, unexpectedly, Amara spoke, her voice softer now, almost distant. "My brother used to wander like you," she said, her gaze fixed on the potted plant, as if it held memories she wasn't ready to share. "He'd get lost sometimes, not just in the streets, but in his head. Took me a long time to figure out how to help him. Still trying, I guess." She didn't elaborate, and Caleb didn't press, but her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain, a glimpse into a life he hadn't anticipated. When he finished eating, Amara handed him a folded blanket, its edges frayed but soft. "You can rest here for a bit," she said, "but you gotta leave before dawn. The guards'll be back, and I can't have them thinking I'm running a shelter." There was a lightness to her tone, a spark of humor, but her eyes were serious, practical. She wasn't naive. She knew the risks of letting a stranger into her space, knew the boundaries of her role here. Yet she'd done it anyway, without hesitation, without expectation. Caleb nodded, clutching the blanket tightly. "I appreciate it," he said, and this time he meant it. As Amara turned to tidy up the kitchenette, stacking dishes with quiet efficiency, he studied her, memorizing the way she moved, the way she carried herself, despite the exhaustion etched into her face. He'd come here to test her, to see if she was just another person playing a part for a paycheck or a favor. But as he sat in her small, tidy shed warmed by her food, her kindness, and the unexpected weight of her words, Caleb began to wonder if he was the one being tested. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, something that made his carefully constructed plan feel small, almost petty, in the face of her quiet, unassuming humanity. The dim light in Amara Jackson's shed cast long shadows across the worn wooden table where Caleb Thornton sat. The blanket she'd given him draped loosely over his knees. Its frayed edges brushed against his fingers, a tactile reminder of the role he was playing, a ragged drifter, not the millionaire who owned the sprawling Buckhead estate just beyond the shed's thin walls. The taste of Amara's homemade stew lingered on his tongue, warm and grounding, a stark contrast to the sterile catered meals he was accustomed to. But his mind was far from the simple meal or the modest surroundings. He'd come to test Amara, to peel back the layers of her character and expose the truth beneath her quiet demeanor. Yet every moment in her presence chipped away at the cynicism he'd built over years of betrayals and false smiles. Amara moved with a quiet purpose, stacking dishes in the tiny kitchenette, her back to him as she hummed a soft, unfamiliar tune, a melody that felt like it carried stories he couldn't yet decipher. The shed, with its faint lavender scent and modest furnishings, felt like a world apart from the glittering excess of his mansion, and Caleb found himself caught between his carefully crafted disguise and the man he was, a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to trust. Outside, the Atlanta night pressed against the shed's small window, the city's distant hum blending with the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the estate's manicured gardens. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the bushes lining the property. Caleb's eyes darted to Amara, who was wiping down the counter with a rag. Her movements methodical, but infused with a care that made the small space feel alive. He wanted to speak, to ask about the brother she'd mentioned earlier, about the weight behind her words, but he held back, reminding himself of his purpose. He was here to observe, to judge, to see if she was just another person playing a part for a paycheck. Yet, her earlier comment about her brother wandering, lost in his head, gnawed at him, stirring questions he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. What kind of life did she lead outside these walls? What burdens did she carry that made her offer kindness to a stranger like him? Amara turned, catching his gaze, and offered a small, tired smile that softened the lines of exhaustion on her face. "You don't talk much, do you?" she said, her tone light, but tinged with curiosity. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed loosely, and for a moment, the weight of her long day was unmistakable. The faint shadows under her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders beneath her navy apron. "That's okay. Sometimes quiet's better than saying the wrong thing." She paused, as if weighing her next words, then gestured toward the cot in the corner, its faded quilt neatly folded. "You can rest there if you need to. I've got to finish up some work in the house, but I'll be back to check on you before I head out." Caleb nodded, his throat tight with a mix of guilt and intrigue. "Thanks," he mumbled, roughening his voice to maintain the disguise of the weary drifter. As Amara slipped out of the shed, closing the door softly behind her, he felt a pang of guilt sharper than before. She was trusting him, a stranger, a nobody in her eyes, with her space, her kindness, her time. He'd expected calculation, maybe a hint of self-interest. But there was none, just a woman who saw someone in need and acted. No questions asked, no agenda hidden in her actions. He shifted in the chair, the blanket slipping slightly, and his eyes wandered to the small shelf of books against the wall. Curiosity pulled him to his feet, and he crossed the room, his worn boots creaking on the wooden floor. He ran a finger along the spine of their eyes were watching God. Its pages worn and dog-eared, some marked with pencil notes in the margins. He flipped it open, catching a glimpse of Amara's neat handwriting. Strength is in the roots, not the branches. The words hit him like a quiet truth, a reminder of something he'd lost touch with in his climb to wealth. He closed the book, feeling like an intruder in her small, personal world. The shed's door creaked open and Caleb spun around, his heart lurching. Amara stood there, holding a mop and a bucket, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Didn't mean to scare you," she said, setting the cleaning supplies against the wall with a soft clatter. "Just grabbing these. The kitchen floor's calling my name and it's not patient." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the book in his hand, then back to his face. "You like to read?" she asked, a spark of interest in her voice. Caleb froze, caught off guard, then nodded. "Yeah, a little," he said, setting the book back on the shelf. "Just passing the time." Amara raised an eyebrow but didn't press, instead offering another faint smile before heading back out. "Don't go stealing my books now," she teased lightly, and the door closed behind her. Alone again, Caleb exhaled, his heart still pounding. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one pulling the strings of this carefully orchestrated test. But Amara's quiet presence was unraveling him. Her kindness wasn't just unexpected, it was disarming, making him question the walls he'd built around himself. He needed to know more to see how far her compassion extended, what drove her to give so freely to someone like him. So when she returned to the shed an hour later, her apron dusted with flour and her braids slightly askew from her work, Caleb decided to push a little further to probe without breaking his cover. "You work late," he said, his voice still rough but less guarded, testing the waters. "Don't you ever get tired?" It was a simple question, meant to draw her out, to see if she'd reveal more of herself. Amara laughed softly, a sound that carried both warmth and weariness, like a candle flickering in a draught. "Tired's my middle name," she said, sinking into the chair across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table. "But you do what you gotta do, right? Bills don't pay themselves, and family don't wait." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, her eyes distant. "My brother Jamal. He's sick. Been sick a long time. Hospital bills pile up faster than you can blink, so I pick up extra shifts when I can. Night shifts, mostly at a diner downtown. Keeps the lights on." Caleb's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to open up so easily, not to a stranger she'd just met. Her words were raw, unfiltered, and they hit him harder than he'd anticipated. "That's a lot," he said, choosing his words carefully to stay in character. "You take care of him alone." Amara nodded, her gaze fixed on the table as if the wood grain held answers she was still searching for. "Mostly. Our mom's gone, and our dad's not in the picture. It's just me and Jamal. He's a good kid, you know, smart, funny, even when he's hurting. I keep telling him he's gonna be an engineer one day, build bridges or something big, but right now, it's about keeping him alive, keeping him fighting." Her words were like a weight settling over Caleb's shoulders. He'd seen hardship before hell. He'd clawed his way out of a rough childhood in a small Georgia town where dreams were as scarce as opportunities. But there was something different about Amara's story, something raw and unyielding in her quiet resilience. He wanted to ask more, to know about Jamal's illness, about the life she led outside this shed, but he stopped himself. He was still the drifter, still the outsider, testing her character. "Sounds like you're strong," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, softer than he'd intended. Amara looked at him, surprised, then shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Strong's what you become when you don't have a choice." You just keep going one step at a time." The conversation lulled, and Amara stood stretching her arms with a quiet groan. "I gotta get back to work," she said, glancing at the clock on the wall, a cheap plastic thing that ticked too loudly. "You stay here, rest. I'll check on you before I leave." She grabbed her mop and bucket, but before she stepped out, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill. She set it on the table, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. For the road, she said simply, "It's not much, but it'll get you a coffee or something to keep you going." Caleb stared at the bill, his throat tight with a mix of guilt and awe. He wanted to refuse to tell her she didn't need to give him anything, but that would break the illusion, unravel the test he'd set in motion. So he nodded, muttering a quiet thanks, and watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. Alone again, Caleb's mind raced the $10 bill sitting on the table like a silent accusation. Amara wasn't just kind, she was selfless, giving what little she had breed without expectation, without a hint of the calculation he'd seen in so many others. Her words about her brother lingered, raising questions he couldn't ignore. What was Jamal's illness? How did she manage the weight of it all? And why, despite everything, did she still find it in herself to help a stranger like him? He needed to know more, not just to complete his test, but to understand the woman who'd turned his carefully laid plan upside down. Slipping out of the shed, he moved quietly toward the mansion, keeping to the shadows to avoid the patrolling guards. The side door was still ajar, and he peered inside, catching sight of Amara mopping the kitchen floor, her movements steady but tinged with exhaustion. The kitchen gleamed under her care, the marble countertops reflecting the overhead lights, a stark reminder of the wealth that surrounded her daily but didn't belong to her. He was about to retreat when he heard a phone ring, her phone vibrating on the counter. Amara set the mop aside and answered it, her voice low but urgent. "Jamal, you okay?" she said, her back stiffening as she gripped the phone. Caleb couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Amara's tone grew sharper, laced with a fear that made his stomach twist. "What do you mean he came by? You didn't let him in, did you? Okay, good. Stay put. Lock the door. I'll be home soon." She hung up her hands, trembling slightly as she leaned against the counter. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if gathering strength. Caleb's mind raced. Who was he? A friend, a family member, a threat. The urgency in her voice told him it wasn't good, that this was more than just a casual call. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt about his plan. This wasn't just a test anymore. It was real, and Amara was caught in something bigger, something that felt dangerous. He slipped back to the shed, his heart pounding his thoughts a tangled mess. Amara's kindness, her brother's illness, the mysterious he on the phone, it was all too much to process. He'd planned to judge her, to weigh her character against his jaded expectations, but now he was the one feeling exposed, caught off guard by the depth of her humanity. When Amara returned to the shed, her face was drawn, the earlier warmth replaced by a quiet tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. "Everything okay?" Caleb asked, testing the waters again, his voice careful. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the floor before meeting his. "Just family stuff," she said, but her voice was tight, her smile forced. She handed him a bottle of water from the fridge, her fingers brushing the table lightly. "You should get some sleep. I'll be back before you leave." As she left again, Caleb sat back, the $10 bill still on the table, a small but heavy reminder of her generosity. He'd planned to slip away before dawn, to end the test, and return to his life of wealth and control. But now, he wasn't sure. Amara's story was pulling him in, and the mention of her brother and the mysterious caller had raised the stakes. He needed to know more, not just about her character, but about the life she led, the burdens she carried, and the danger that seemed to lurk just beyond her tired smile. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something stir inside him, a mix of guilt, admiration, and a nagging sense that his carefully controlled experiment was slipping out of his hands, pulling him into a story he hadn't written. Caleb Thornton sat in the quiet of Amara Jackson's shed, the $10 bill still resting on the table like a silent challenge to his carefully orchestrated test. The Atlanta night pressed against the shed's small window, the distant hum of the city, now a faint backdrop to the storm brewing in his mind. Amara's words about her brother Jamal, her trembling voice on the phone, and the mysterious he who'd caused her fear had shattered the neat boundaries of Caleb's experiment. He'd come to Buckhead to judge her, to weigh her character against his jaded expectations. But now, he was the one unraveling, caught in the gravity of her life, a life that felt more real, more urgent than his own. The blanket she'd given him lay folded on the chair, its frayed edges a reminder of her unassuming kindness, and the shed's faint lavender scent lingered, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. He'd planned to slip away before dawn, to end the test, and return to his polished world of wealth and control. But the weight of what he'd learned about Amara held him in place. The door creaked open, and Amara stepped back inside her navy apron, now untied and draped over her arm. Her face was drawn, the earlier warmth replaced by a quiet tension that made her movements sharp, almost hurried. She set the apron on the counter and glanced at Caleb, her eyes flickering with something unspoken worry, perhaps, or resolve. "You still here," she said, her voice soft, but tinged with exhaustion. "Thought you might have taken off by now." There was no accusation in her tone, just a quiet observation, and Caleb felt another pang of guilt. He was an intruder in her world, a millionaire playing a game while she faced real struggles he was only beginning to understand. "Didn't want to leave without saying thanks," he said, roughening his voice to maintain the disguise. He gestured to the $10 bill. "For this. For everything." Amara shrugged, a faint smile breaking through her fatigue. "It's nothing. Just don't waste it, okay?" She paused, then added, "You got somewhere to go, somewhere safe." The question caught Caleb off guard. He'd expected her to push him out to protect her own space, but here she was, still concerned for a stranger she barely knew. He nodded, mumbling, "Yeah, I'll figure it out." But his mind was racing. He needed to know more about the phone call, about the danger lurking in her life. But he couldn't ask without risking his cover. Amara nodded, accepting his vague response, and began tidying the shed, her movements automatic but precise. Caleb watched her, noting the way she straightened the books on the shelf, the way her fingers lingered on the potted plant, as if drawing strength from its green leaves. He wanted to stay, to dig deeper, but the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, and he knew his time was running out. He was about to stand when Amara's phone buzzed again, the sound sharp in the quiet shed. She froze her hand, hovering over the counter, then answered it with a tense, "Jamal, what's wrong?" Caleb's ears strained to catch the conversation, but Jamal's voice was too faint. Amara's expression darkened, her free hand clenching into a fist. "He did what, Jamal?" "You stay inside, you hear me? Don't open the door for anyone. I'm coming home now." She hung up her breath uneven, and for a moment she stood still, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if grounding herself. Caleb's stomach twisted. The he from earlier was back, and whatever was happening was serious, serious enough to pull Amara away from her work. her routine, her calm. "Everything okay?" Caleb asked, his voice careful, testing the waters. Amara looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing whether to trust him. "Family trouble," she said finally, her voice tight. "My brother's in a mess, and I gotta go handle it." She grabbed her jacket from a hook by the door. Her movements hurried now, and Caleb felt a surge of urgency. He couldn't let her walk into danger alone, not after what he'd seen, not after the kindness she'd shown him. But revealing his identity now would unravel everything, expose his test for what it was. He hesitated, torn between his plan and the reality unfolding before him. "Let me help," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Amara paused, her hand on the doorknob, and turned to face him. Her brow furrowed. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Why would you want to help?" Caleb swallowed, scrambling for an answer that wouldn't break his cover. "You helped me," he said simply. "Seems only fair." It was a weak excuse, but it was all he could manage without revealing too much. Amara studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Appreciate it, but this ain't your fight. Stay here, rest. I'll be fine." She stepped out, closing the door behind her, and Caleb was left alone, his heart pounding. He couldn't stay. Not now, not after hearing the fear in her voice, the urgency that hinted at something dangerous. He slipped out of the shed, keeping to the shadows of the estate's gardens to avoid the guards. The night air was thick, the jasmine scent stronger now, mingling with the faint tang of car exhaust from the city beyond. He moved quickly, his worn boots silent on the grass, until he reached the edge of the property where he saw Amara climbing into an old beat-up sedan parked near the service entrance. Her face was set, her jaw tight, and Caleb knew he couldn't let her go alone. He jogged to his own car, a nondescript rental he'd parked a block away, to maintain his disguise, and followed her, keeping his distance as her taillights disappeared into the Atlanta night. Amara's car led him to a rundown apartment complex on the city's west side, far from the polished streets of Buckhead. The building was a maze of cracked concrete and flickering lights, the kind of place Caleb hadn't seen since his childhood in rural Georgia. He parked a block away, pulling his cap low, and watched as Amara hurried inside, her jacket pulled tight against the chill. He weighted his mind, racing with possibilities. Who was threatening Jamal? A debt collector? A gang member? He didn't know, but the fear in Amara's voice told him it was serious. Minutes later, he saw her emerge, pulling a young man, Jamal, he assumed, by the arm. Jamal was tall, but frail, his face pale under the streetlights, his steps unsteady as Amara guided him to the car. Before they could drive off, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a wiry man in a leather jacket, his posture aggressive. Caleb's heart sank. The man was shouting his words indistinct, but his tone menacing, and Amara stood her ground, her voice rising in defiance. "You stay away from him, Darius," she snapped, pushing Jamal behind her. "We're paying what we can. You don't get to come here and threaten us." Darius laughed a cold, sharp sound and took a step closer, his hand slipping into his pocket. Caleb's blood ran cold. He didn't know what Darius was reaching for, a weapon maybe, but he wasn't going to wait to find out. He stepped out of his car, his disguise still intact, and approached the scene, his voice rough but steady. "Hey, back off!" he called, drawing Darius's attention. Amara turned her eyes, widening in shock. "You," she said, her voice a mix of confusion and alarm. Darius sneered, sizing Caleb up. "Who's this, your homeless bodyguard?" he taunted, but Caleb didn't flinch. "Leave them alone," he said, his tone firm, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, the air was thick with tension, Darius's hand still in his pocket, Amara's eyes darting between them. Then with a muttered curse, Darius backed off, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. Amara turned to Caleb, her expression a storm of emotions: gratitude, suspicion, exhaustion. "Why'd you follow me?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. Caleb hesitated, his disguise teetering on the edge of collapse. "I couldn't let you go alone," he said, sticking to his role as the drifter. "You helped me. I owed you." Amara's eyes softened, but her guard was still up. "You don't owe me anything," she said, helping Jamal into the car. "But thank you." She paused, then added, "Get out of here before he comes back. This ain't your mess." Caleb nodded, but as Amara drove away, he made a decision. He couldn't keep up the charade any longer, not after seeing her stand up to Darius, not after learning about Jamal's illness and the debts that haunted her. The next morning, he returned to the mansion as himself, shedding the tattered coat and cap for his usual tailored suit. He called his lawyer and arranged to pay off Jamal's medical bills, anonymously ensuring Amara wouldn't know it was him. He also hired a private investigator to look into Darius, suspecting he was more than just a debt collector. When he saw Amara at the mansion later that day, she was different, lighter, almost as if a weight had been lifted. "Someone paid for Jamal's treatment," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know who, but it's a miracle." Caleb nodded, his heart heavy with the truth he wasn't ready to reveal. "I'm glad," he said simply, and let her return to her work. Over the next few days, he watched her from a distance, noting the way she smiled more, the way her steps were less burdened. His investigator confirmed that Darius was tied to a local loan shark, and Caleb quietly ensured the man would never bother Amara or Jamal again, using his wealth to pull strings he'd once sworn never to touch. When he finally revealed his identity to Amara, explaining the test he'd set, she was stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You went through all that? Just to see if I'd be kind?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and exasperation. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "I didn't expect to learn from you," he admitted. "But I did." Amara shook her head, a small smile breaking through. "You're a strange man, Mr. Thornton," she said, but there was no malice in her words, only a quiet respect. Caleb smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in years. He'd set out to test her, to find a crack in her character, but instead, he'd found a mirror, one that showed him the emptiness of his own wealth, the hollowness of a life spent guarding against betrayal. Amara's kindness, her resilience, her willingness to give without expecting anything in return, had taught him something he'd forgotten. True wealth, Bipulth, wasn't in money or power, but in the quiet strength of a generous heart. As he watched Amara return to her work, her head high despite the long hours, Caleb made a silent vow. He'd use his resources to do more, not just for Amara and Jamal, but for others like them, people who carried heavy burdens with grace. The test he'd planned had become a lesson, one that reshaped his understanding of the world. He'd spent years building walls to protect himself, but Amara had shown him that real strength lay in tearing them down, in offering a hand to those who needed it most. And as he looked out over the Atlanta skyline from his mansion's windows, the city's lights twinkling like stars, Caleb felt for the first time in a long time that the world was still full of good people, people worth believing in. The lesson was clear, and it was one Caleb would carry forward. Kindness given freely was a currency more valuable than any fortune he'd ever amassed. It was a reminder to look beyond appearances, to see the humanity in others, and to act with compassion no matter the cost. Amara's small shed with its potted plant and worn books had become a classroom, and her quiet strength a teacher. For anyone listening, the message was simple but profound. True wealth lies in the heart, in the courage to care, and in the belief that even in a world of superficiality, there are still those who shine with genuine, selfless light.